Hey
everybody, welcome to the Headwater Science Center live stream. So before I get into this today, the Headwater Science Center, we're open 7 days a week. We're open from 9:30 to 5, Monday through Saturday, and on Sunday, we're open 1 to 5. So today, we're going to go over a pretty cool animal, Gigantopithecus. It's an animal that kind of got a little bit of boost in popularity in the past 20 years. It's a bit more commonly known, but it's an animal that we don't actually have as much material as people tend to think about it. So Gigantopithecus is the largest ape to ever live, theoretically, if size estimates are correct. And we'll get into how size estimates could be a bit weird with this animal. So it would be in the class Mammalia, the order Primates, the family Hominidae, the genus Gigantopithecus. Now, these guys were also close relatives to orangutans, the Pongidae apes, which used to be a more diverse family of apes.
And that would be between the family and genus, right?
Yeah. And then there is only one species of Gigantopithecus scientifically recognized, and that is Gigantopithecus blacki. Their size is very difficult to determine due to the material we have left of them, but it is generally thought to be around 440 pounds to 660 pounds. For reference, animals that are around 660 pounds, that could be something like a bull, a grizzly bear. Very large ape, just for reference. We get nowhere near that size normally. And these things lived from about 2 million years ago to 300,000 years ago. And they lived in southern China, Vietnam, and Thailand. And they're really only known from a very specific set of skeletal parts. Those being about 4 mandibles that were found in caves in southern China, and approximately 2,000 teeth. Molars, incisors, canines, various teeth in the animal's jaw. Found in various places such as caves and traditional Chinese medicine shops, where they were sold as dragon teeth. A very generic term for fossil or skeletal teeth with no skull associated with them. These animals were likely herbivorous. Those teeth show a lot of isotopes from C3 plants, and we'll get into those actually near the end of this. James has a little bit more knowledge on this than me. But roughly we understand what they being stuff like deciduous leaves, grasses like bamboo, seeds, and other vegetative matter that needed a little bit more chewing. Their teeth were quite robust and had a very thick layer of enamel, the thickest layer of enamel of any ape that we have on record. So a big thing with these guys is they could potentially have been massive, or might have just had a really big jaw and teeth, but not been on as nearly extreme a body as some people think. The other thing, as we're going over with these animals, modern humans never interacted with these guys, but Homo erectus, who we have our skull out, did actually interact with these. There is a overlap in fossil area for the species. So the other question about these to address is, why do we only have mandibles and teeth? And this comes down to a few things. So the first thing is these animals lived in a very tropical area. Tropical places with a lot of heat and humidity and a lot of biological activity, plants and decomposers and stuff. They're not great for fossilization. The bones and skeletons and other material don't preserve well in that habitat. So oftentimes animals almost fully decompose before anything like fossilization can occur. The other thing about these animals that leads to them not fossilizing well. So the one specimens we do have, you might have noticed I said, were from caves. So modern day orangutans, oftentimes when they are sick, will hide out in caves until they get better. Now sometimes they don't get better and they pass away. These guys clearly did a similar behavior. So when they got sick, they would probably hide away in a cave somewhere where they could rest safer from predators, and oftentimes they would pass away. And that's where they would die. Now, the reason we don't have skeletons from those Gigantopithecus is because of another species of animal altogether, which is the modern-day Asian porcupines, who existed at the time as well. And they have a kind of nasty habit when it comes from a paleontological perspective of gnawing and chewing on bones for calcium to get that more in their diet, which helps their bodies produce the keratin and calcium needed for quills. But the problem for us as paleontologists, scientists in general, is that porcupines often will chew up something that could have fossilized, like the bulk of a Gigantopithecus skeleton, leaving us with only the toughest bits left that they could not chew through, even with their very robust jaws and teeth, which happen to be the robust jaws and teeth of Gigantopithecus were the only things that were withstanding that, really. And I want to talk about paleontology and how sometimes we don't often have lots of these animals left, so reconstructions should always be taken with a grain of salt and be open to newer interpretations as more data comes in. We may one day find a more complete Gigantopithecus skeleton, which could totally change how this animal is reconstructed in art. I have drawn it here looking more like an orangutan, simply because genetically that is its closest relative. That's the closest I have to go off of. They could have been more shaped like a gorilla or shaped like a type of ape that we just don't have anymore. A totally different sort of shape and face and everything. And the other question about these apes, so just to get into the potential if they were very large, what the advantage of being so massive would be. As we've talked about again, for herbivores, it's a great defense mechanism against predators. Keeps people off you. Nobody wants to go after the giant ape who could toss you across a whole like forest clearing. The other thing is these were, from what we can tell, herbivores, and for herbivores it really pays to be big because you have a longer digestive tract. That food spends more time getting digested. You can get more out of the food. You can stuff more food in your face. It's an overall dietary advantage. And then why did these go extinct? The big hypothesis for how these went extinct was climate and environmental shifts. From what we can tell from the plants they ate and the environmental paleontology that we do have from the area, they lived in what we would call a mosaic habitat, where forest and open areas mix together in sort of a patchwork. And as that habitat shifted at the time to a more open grassland area, these animals were left without nearly as much, not only food, but cover and the habitat they preferred to spend their time in. And unfortunately, they were not able to adapt. As these changes between grassland and forest happened multiple times, their populations, from what we can tell, declined slightly. And possibly by the end there simply wasn't a large enough population of these animals to withstand another swing from forest to grassland. Majority. Another thing I want to go over in this one really quick, because I've been referring to this as an ape. It is an ape. How do we tell apes from monkeys? And this is something where those terms are not interchangeable. People often use them interchangeably, but scientifically that is not correct. And also it can be a bit annoying, especially to people who do know the difference, to constantly hear people pointing at something like a gorilla or an orangutan and going, it's a monkey. So generally with apes, apes lack tails. Is a huge thing. Everything from gibbons, which are the lesser apes, to us and the other great apes, we do not have tails. Unfortunately, we don't have prehensile tails. That'd be kind of fun. Another big difference between apes and monkeys is apes tend to have larger cranium and larger brains and tend to be a little bit smarter. Although there are some monkeys that tend to break that rule. Capuchin monkeys in South America, who are New World monkeys, are quite intelligent. Another thing with apes tend simply to be bigger. The largest monkeys tend to be about the size of a large dog. Those would be stuff like mandrills and baboons, whereas apes can be quite large. Gibbons are the exception on the ape side of that, being around the size of large monkeys or medium monkeys. Another difference is the method at which they climb when they do climb. I'm sure everybody has seen a chimpanzee or an orangutan or a gibbon swinging from branch to branch using their arms. It's a very specific kind of movement called brachiation. So they're brachiate climbers. Monkeys are cursorial climbers. They run with all fours on top of the tree branches. They do not suspend from them. Other than that, there are a few more, but those are things we can get into in a totally different live stream, I think. And I'm going to turn it over really quickly to James, just to talk about C3 plants.
Yeah.
And what makes those different than other plants.
So, it's hard to talk about a C3 plant because C3 stands for the number of carbons in an intermediate without getting a little bit into biochemistry, but I will try my best to keep it at a level that's not too jargony. But so essentially, plants produce their food through photosynthesis. I'm sure we've all heard that. And what they do to do that is they take in carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and they sort of mix those up through a very complex, what they call metabolic cycle, called the, I should look it up, it's the Kelvin cycle, but it has multiple names, and I want to give the full name. It's called the, well, yeah, the Kelvin cycle is what Wikipedia has to say about it. But so the way that the Kelvin cycle works is I might have to draw a little bit.
Yeah, feel free to draw up here.
Okay. I'll aim it down a little bit. And I'm going to try not to draw anything that's super, so be aware that consider this more a model than an actual demonstration of the biochemistry. But it's definitely worth knowing. So you have a cycle. It starts with a thing called rubisco. It's a 5-carbon molecule, and we'll just look at the carbons for now. We don't have to worry about anything else. So each one of those dots is a carbon, and they're all covalently bonded together. And so this is the starting point, and this is what we call a enzyme or a catalyst, which is a chemical intermediate, a thing that goes into a chemical reaction that lowers the activation energy, essentially making it easier to do a chemical reaction, and then is restored at the end of the reaction. So this thing isn't actually used up. It's sort of like, you can imagine that if you were cooking food, it would be really helpful to have a table to cook your food on, to be able to do your chopping and mixing. It's really helpful to have bowls and cutting boards and stuff to do that. But it's not like you're using up the cutting board in the process. It just makes it easier to do your cooking. So what happens is you take in carbon dioxide and sunlight to catalyze the reaction. So CO2 and light. And CO2, we know, you can imagine as a single carbon here. This is CO2. And so CO2 is added, and you make a 6-carbon molecule. And then, this is where the C3 part of the cycle comes in. Through another, what we call enzymatic process, which is a catalyzed or kind of helped out process, imagine the cutting board. This splits down into 2 3-carbon molecules. And then one of these 3-carbon molecules goes off and is added into a sugar block, a sugar matrix. And that becomes the plant food. That's the photosynthesis. And this other one enters back into the cycle. And then there's a big long process. And what would happen is this cycle would happen 3 times. 5 of these would go into regeneration, and 1 comes out as a product, which is turned into sugar.
And that's the carbon 3 that they would be basically being able to find on the teeth residue.
Exactly. And so that's what it is. This is the critical point right here. These are 3-carbon pieces, and that's why it's C3. Now the distinction of what the major thing to think about of why this matters, what's the difference between a C3 and what's called a C4 plant or a CAM plant, you can look those up, those are just different metabolic cycles, is that C3 plants take in their carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And what that means is then they are dependent on the heat that's around them. Rubisco, which is the name of this 5-carbon intermediate here, is dependent on heat and light for how fast it works. And so if you have it too hot or too cold, what's going to happen is that it's going to start producing, this cycle is going to go way too fast. It's going to be what's called oxidative phosphorylation. Doesn't really matter. You can look it up if you want. But it generally destroys a plant. So the alternative is C4 or CAM mechanisms, and they, instead of taking in CO2 from outside, they convert it from another intermediate like this. So that's a very, very rough overview of C3 versus C4 and CAM metabolism. Look it up if you would like to learn more, or come and talk to us, because
you could do a live stream on that.
I could definitely, yeah, that would be fun.
So another thing you might see on the table I brought out are 2 other skulls. I want to go over these really quick. They have a gorilla, and gorillas are another ape that have a lot of enamel on their teeth, and they're also very terrestrial. Gorillas in adulthood don't often climb trees, which is one of the reasons a lot of people tend to think Gigantopithecus may have been more like a gorilla than an orangutan when it comes to its anatomy, because of the similar lifestyle. You can see it has those big, thick teeth. But there's also kind of another kind of fun, just coincidental bit of convergent evolution, just to talk about that again, just to get that subject more in here, is Paranthropus. So this is a relative of some very early relatives of us, related to the Australopithecines. Paranthropus was pretty big for the time, being about 5 feet tall, probably close in weight to a gorilla, and they are known for having these thick teeth, very similar to those molars Gigantopithecus had. You'll notice even their canine teeth are kind of flattened out into just more molars, essentially. And these guys ate a similar diet to Gigantopithecus, a lot of grasses and seeds and harsh things, and they needed these strong jaws, these thick mandibles, deep-rooted teeth, and a lot of muscle attached to it. So a thing you'll notice on this guy's skull compared to Homo erectus, other than a few differences in shape, is that he has what we call a sagittal crest. And the gorilla actually has an even more extreme sagittal crest, which is this. And if you ever see a gorilla in real life, you might notice they have very cone-shaped heads. The cone on top of their head is actually a lot of that muscle, which is anchored there and goes through these holes here, which we call the zygomatic arches, and attaches to the mandible. So it gives them a lot of force to pull up with their jaw and kind of work at tougher vegetative material. And you'll notice that Paranthropus here, very large openings for muscle, and a decent enough sagittal crest where he could get pretty good bite force on there. It's a very common trait of herbivorous apes to have these sagittal crests and very wide zygomatic arches that actually are the bone, kind of your cheekbone here. And I want to point out the similarity because oftentimes you will see Gigantopithecus drawn or portrayed with a more gorilla-shaped head. And that is a reason we can somewhat infer a bit from those teeth. Potentially it relied on them a little bit more. Do you have any questions on just the animal itself in general?
Myself?
Yeah, just get a few more little things in here.
I'm trying to think. So, you said that these were mostly in Southeast Asia, and you said they were mostly eating bamboo.
Mostly eating bamboo and other kind of tough vegetation, so stuff like seeds and stuff where they needed like the teeth like that to.
So do you think they kind of operated in, I know they're not genetically related, but in a similar niche to pandas today?
That is something they have been compared to a lot. I toyed around jokingly with the idea of drawing this as sort of a panda coloration, actually. But yeah, people often do call them the primate equivalent, potentially, to a panda, which is kind of interesting. The biggest media portrayal of Gigantopithecus, I think I can see, was in that recent Jungle Book movie, where they had Christopher Walken as King Louie, and instead of an orangutan, they made King Louis a Gigantopithecus.
Yeah.
Massively large.
Yeah.
A little bit bigger than Gigantopithecus actually would have been, even accounting for the fact that the main character was a child standing next to him. He was like, what, like a 20-foot tall ape. Where these guys would have been big, but not that big.
Like 7 feet tall?
They potentially could have been 7 or 8 feet tall if they stood up. These apes probably, if they were as large as we think, probably wouldn't have gone on their hind legs that much other than to reach stuff. So another thing a lot of times people talk about with Gigantopithecus too is, I think Chuck was talking about it earlier with Sasquatch. People tend to be like, oh, is this what people think like Sasquatch was? Unfortunately, that's probably not very likely, as modern humans never interacted with this species. Long gone by the time we reached that area. And also likely was not bipedal, just given the potential mass that they could have had.
Yeah.
I'm very hopeful for eventually more remains of these to be found. I would love to have a clearer picture of what these animals looked like, because they are so interesting. Oftentimes the fossil apes, other than the stuff like our ancestors, like the Australopithecines and the other almost like hominids, tend to kind of get ignored because they're not quite as in line with the narrative we like in our archaeology and paleontology of the human evolution, and they tend to
sort of humans as a peak, as opposed to humans as just another stage.
They kind of get written off as, and there's other apes around. And apes also tend not to live in habitats that preserve very well, so when we do get specimens, they're not always the best. But if we could get a good specimen of this, I would be super excited. It would change how we see the Pongidae apes.
Do you think that, because, and I don't really know a ton about pandas, but I tend to think that they're not super social.
I think Gigantopithecus being a primate, they likely could have been like a gorilla where they were very social. Yeah. Or they could have been like orangutans who live in the woods by themselves.
It's kind of solitary.
And hang out occasionally. But other than that, they
mostly just kind of wandering around.
Or they could have been like gibbons who mate for life and they live in pairs with a few children hanging around. There's a number of social structures, or lack of social structures, these apes could have had.
What do you think is? Do you think it's more likely that they had a social structure or that they didn't?
I think, just in my knowledge of apes, I think it is more likely, especially a ground-dwelling ape, that they have some sort of social structure.
Yeah. Just safety in numbers, sort of.
Safety in some numbers, and just that being on the ground requires a little bit more, I think, social interaction. It's why gorillas are incredibly social. They live on the ground, they need those safety numbers, but with safety numbers, the social bonds are really important. That's why you go out of your way to protect the other gorilla from like a leopard or something.
Because trade-off is then you'll get protected at some point.
You'll get help too. Yep. In the gorilla's case, really, the silverback does do all of the putting himself out at risk because that's his job.
Right.
The females are basically there to hang out, support, socialize, and the silverback is there to protect everyone, help raise the kids.
What happens to the young males?
Young male gorillas tend to leave the troop. They're the ones who go out and look for a new place to live, and then female gorillas, the females will also eventually go off. But oftentimes with gorillas, the other thing with the gorillas is the silverback in a gorilla troop is only there if the females like him. If female gorillas don't like a silverback for whatever reason, if he's a little bit too aggressive, not doing a good job, he won't have a troop of gorillas for that long. Gorillas...
So will young males kind of hang around a silverback and try to supplant them?
Young males often do stay in the general area. They avoid the troop in general because the silverback generally is not hugely welcome of competition. But as he gets older, challenges come in more and more frequently. They know when someone's old, and that's when troops tend to switch over. Although sometimes gorillas hold on to troop leadership very late. Some of them have just died in the position.
Really?
Yeah, some silverbacks are very...
Depending on how good of an administrator they are?
Yeah, depending on how popular they are with females and stuff, and with the other gorillas in the troop, they can go there till the day they die. Another thing with gorillas that's kind of interesting, at least in my eyes, is that so in primates in general, the apes, as we age, our physical peak for strength is not what we call our prime. Like, our 20s is not when you actually have the greatest potential to be physically strong. It's actually more like in your 30s or 40s when you have the greatest potential to really bulk up and get strong.
For apes?
For apes, for us and other apes. So as they get older, they can get a lot stronger.
Oh, really? I didn't. So you can actually
like
get
a 20 or
stronger.
So like a 30-year-old gorilla is pretty
It's like
formidable.
peak, kinda.
They're pretty formidable, and it's something where you'll often hear old man strength thrown around at the gym.
Yeah.
Other apes have that as well. We're not the only ones with it.
That's funny.
But yeah, no, so another thing with gorillas and social structure is not every male gorilla is a full silverback. There are hormonal changes that come with that. You'll see it with monkeys as well, where in that position there's a hormonal shift. They'll get more silver hair on the back. And old silverbacks who've been sitting in that position for a long time, basically their arms still have that dark black fur that you know with gorillas. But then, like, most of them is silver at that point.
Yeah.
They look very distinctive at that age. We don't know, like, Gigantopithecus could have had some sort of thing like a silverback, which would have been really interesting. Again, they could have been like any modern ape we have today. They could have been like none of them.
So there's
We just don't have enough material.
So we're sort of speculating that it's orangutan-like.
We're speculating that it is physically orangutan-like simply because genetically they are related to
closely.
apes.
But that's the thing, is that there can be really rapid changes even if they're
Yeah.
closely related.
And even in those close related, let's think of it this way, other than the pungent apes like the orangutans, look at the apes in Africa. In that group of apes, you have everything from the chimpanzee, the gorilla, the bonobo, and us.
Yeah. A lot of variation.
That's a lot of difference.
Yeah.
It can be like there's a lot of difference in genetically closely related groups. So these guys really could have looked like anything. They're incredibly fascinating though. And just conceptually, I think they stand out because who doesn't want a big ape, essentially?
Yeah.
It's a fun one. And I used to love these as a kid. I think that one of the bigger representations I've seen in media of these two was, I think again, Zoo Tycoon 2, you can get these. And there, they kind of made them look a little bit more gorilla-like.
Yeah.
And they went with the idea that they were pretty big. But yeah, so for Gigantopithecus, this is about all we got. Next week for the live stream, I'll have a guest coming in. He's a friend of mine. He's going to talk about an animal that he has worked with. So we're going to take one quick little break from prehistoric animals on my next live stream. So Saturday or Monday, depending on which day works best for them. So look for that. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.